Welcome to the quiet hours, the time of night when the world strips away its noise and leaves us alone with whatever still waits in the dark. You are listening to Midnight Echo Radio, and as always, I am your host, Seraphine Corvin. Tonight, I want to talk about something deceptively simple. I want to talk about looking. We trust our eyes more than almost anything else. We trust them to warn us, to guide us, to separate the harmless from the dangerous. We believe, instinctively, that if we can see a threat clearly enough, we can understand it. And if we can understand it, we can escape it. But buried inside the sealed archives of the SCP Foundation, there exists a secret that turns that belief inside out. A secret so catastrophic that the most dangerous thing you can do is not touch it, or speak to it, or stand too close to it. The most dangerous thing you can do is look. Deep underground, far from the public, there is a perfect steel cube. Airtight, windowless, 5 meters by 5 meters by 5 meters. For most anomalies, containment begins with observation. Cameras in the corners, thermal feeds, motion tracking. Armed personnel studying every shift in posture and every twitch in the dark. The Foundation survives by keeping its eyes on the things it fears. But not here. There are no cameras inside this chamber. No live video, no optical tools, no viewing slit. No emergency port through which anyone can take a quick, confirming glance. The people assigned to this object are forbidden from doing the one thing human beings always want to do when confronted with danger: see it for themselves. Instead, they rely on absence. Pressure sensors hidden beneath the floor, laser detectors measuring movement through interruption. Indirect readouts translated into sterile data on a safe monitor somewhere else. The personnel outside the chamber do not watch a creature. They watch numbers. They watch shifting indicators and patterns. They watch proof that something is still in the room, without ever allowing themselves to verify it with their own eyes. They do not look. They must never look. And that unnatural blindness changes everything. Routine maintenance becomes a ritual of controlled dread. The steel walls are checked for the slightest fracture, the smallest hairline compromise, because even the possibility of accidental visual exposure feels intolerable. The threat is not simply that the occupant might escape. It is that some tiny failure in procedure could allow its image, or a reflection of its face, to reach the wrong eyes. The result would not be one death, or even a contained breach. It would be the beginning of a chain reaction. Inside that chamber resides SCP-096. To the uninitiated, it is sometimes called the Shy Guy. It is a name so strangely gentle that it almost feels obscene. It suggests awkwardness, embarrassment, a kind of harmless retreat. But the truth is something colder, sadder, and infinitely worse. SCP-096 is humanoid, but only in the broadest, most unsettling sense. It stands roughly 2.38 meters tall, a height that would already make it alarming, even if the rest of it were normal. But nothing about it is normal. Its body is emaciated to the point of wrongness, all long bones and taut, pale skin, with almost no visible muscle mass. Its arms are grotesquely overlong, stretching down so far they seem nearly designed for some other shape of movement. Its skin is completely hairless and almost entirely devoid of pigment, giving it the look of something that never belonged beneath sunlight at all. Something dredged up from a lightless trench. something unfinished. Its face is worse. Human enough to be recognized, distorted enough to be remembered. Blank white eyes. A mouth capable of opening far beyond anything a human jaw should allow. Features that seem fixed in a state of unbearable misery. There is something about SCP-096 that does not only trigger fear, it triggers a kind of involuntary sorrow, a helpless revulsion braided together with pity. Because for the vast majority of its existence, it is passive. The sensors in the chamber report the same thing over and over again. Pacing by the eastern wall, long intervals of stillness, small shifts in weight, aimless movement, like a prisoner with nowhere to go and nothing left to do except count out eternity one step at a time. And sometimes, the pacing stops, and then it cries. Personnel posted outside the chamber have reported hearing it through the steel. Whimpering, sobbing, low, broken babbling that makes almost no sense and yet sounds horribly, unmistakably human in its distress. Not the growl of a predator, not the rage of a beast. The sound of something miserable, something ashamed, something trapped in a darkness so complete that even listening to it for too long starts to feel intimate in a way it should not. That may be the first real psychological trap of SCP-096. The impulse to pity it, to see something wounded in its weeping, to mistake passivity for safety, to imagine, however briefly, that what paces in the dark is more prisoner than monster. That illusion ends the moment someone sees its face, and that is the curse at the center of SCP-096. It does not matter whether the face is seen directly in person, on a screen, or preserved in an old photograph. It does not matter whether the viewer fully understands what they are seeing. It does not matter whether they study the image, glance at it by accident, or register it only as some fleeting detail at the edge of their vision. If the visual information is processed, if those features are seen, the connection is made. The creature knows. The moment exposure occurs, SCP-096 enters a state of extreme emotional distress. It covers its face with its hands. It screams. It howls with a kind of grief so intense it barely sounds survivable. And then, after that first eruption of misery, something even worse begins. Not immediately. That is part of the horror. The victim is granted a brief interval, approximately 1 to 2 minutes, a pause between cause and consequence, a tiny strip of ordinary time left hanging over the abyss. Think about what that means for a moment. Somewhere in the world, someone glances at the wrong image. They blink, they look away, they continue whatever they were doing. They may not feel anything at all beyond a passing shiver. They may not consciously register the danger. And during those next few moments, their life remains outwardly untouched. The room is still the room. Their coffee is still warm. The rain is still moving against the window. They exist inside a mercy so brief, it feels almost cruel. Because when that interval ends, SCP-096 stops crying and begins to move. At that point, it no longer feels like an organism. It feels like a verdict. It does not need to search. It does not need scent, trail, or signal. It knows where the viewer is with impossible precision. Distance does not matter. Terrain does not matter. Barriers, fortifications, armed response, entire landscapes standing between predator and prey mean nothing. Once the face has been seen, pursuit becomes inevitable. And inevitable is the word that matters most with SCP-096. The Foundation, of course, tried to understand the boundaries of that inevitability. They always do. They test, they isolate variables, they look for loopholes in the impossible. One of their most chilling experiments was designed to answer a deceptively narrow question. If a true image of SCP-096 is fatal to view, what about an artistic representation? To answer that, they selected a D-class subject who had once worked as a tattoo artist. He was placed alone inside a bathysphere diving bell and lowered miles underwater, tens of kilometers from containment, into a depth so crushing and black that the isolation itself became part of the experiment. There, sealed inside the pressure vessel with no sunlight, no rescue, and no company except his instructions, he was ordered to unseal a photograph of SCP-096 and sketch what he saw. It is worth lingering there for a moment. Not on the result, but on the setting. The claustrophobia of that metal sphere, the pencil in his hand, the knowledge that if the image worked the way the Foundation suspected, then distance would not save him, water would not save him, and the ocean itself would simply become another corridor through which something impossible could come. When the artist exposed the photograph, SCP-096 reacted. It breached containment, plunged into the water, and crossed the abyss to reach him. He managed, with the last fragments of his life, to lock the finished sketch inside a separate, autonomous submersible before the bathysphere was torn open and he was reduced to nothing in the dark. When the drawing was recovered, the Foundation learned two things. First, a hand-drawn depiction did not trigger the effect. Second, whatever lived in the true captured image was somehow more than shape alone. The sketch showed the white eyes, the distended jaw, the outline of the face. But it did not carry the fatal quality of the original visual data. A drawing was safe. A real image was not. That distinction might sound like a technical comfort. In reality, it only sharpened the terror, because it meant that SCP-096 was not just a dangerous organism. It was also an information hazard, a trap embedded in reality itself. Not merely a body in a room, but a lethal piece of visual knowledge. And once you understand that, the most famous SCP-096 incident stops feeling like a story about a monster and starts feeling like a story about how fragile ordinary life really is. Sometime in the 1990s, an amateur mountaineer took a photograph of himself during a hike through a frozen mountain range. Just a vacation snapshot. One of those forgettable little trophies people bring home to prove they were once somewhere cold and beautiful. Snowfields stretching behind him, distance swallowing detail. Nothing in the image that would have seemed even slightly remarkable at the time. Then the photo went into storage. It sat among old memories for years, a harmless object in a box. The kind of thing that gathers silence around itself in attics and closets while entire decades pass overhead. No alarms, no Foundation teams crashing through the door. No hint that the image contained anything except the mountain, the man, and the ordinary past. But somewhere in the far background of that photo, from roughly a mile away, SCP-096 had been captured by accident. Not fully, not clearly. 4 pixels. That is one of the details that makes this incident so difficult to shake. Not a full portrait, not a close-up, not a dramatic discovery. 4 blurry pixels in the corner of a landscape. A microscopic intrusion into an otherwise mundane photograph. The kind of visual noise a human brain is built to ignore. Years later, the mountaineer looked through his old pictures. Maybe he was reminiscing. Maybe he was just killing time. Maybe he was younger in the photo than he felt when he found it again, and the image pulled him briefly into the old comfort of memory. However it happened, his eyes passed across the composition, and somewhere in that completely ordinary act of looking, those 4 pixels were processed. He did not know what he had seen, but SCP-096 did. Deep underground, inside the steel chamber, the pacing stopped. The crying transformed. Sensors erupted with impossible readings as the entity entered full distress. Personnel responded. Security moved. And then the chamber failed. Accounts from the incident describe the reinforced steel being torn apart with horrifying ease. Whatever calm existed around SCP-096's passive state disappeared instantly, replaced by a violence so complete that the Foundation resorted to Code Lima and flooded the chamber with nerve gas. It killed staff. It did nothing meaningful to the anomaly. Within minutes, SCP-096 had breached the facility and was moving across open terrain in a direct line toward the mountaineer. Think about the victim in that window of time. Somewhere far away, perhaps putting the photograph back into its box. Perhaps sitting quietly in his home, never knowing he had done anything wrong. Not understanding that what looked like a memory had become a death sentence. Not understanding that something had already begun running for him. The Foundation tried to intercept, and because human institutions have a hard time accepting helplessness, they reached for technology. This became Project Scramble. At its core, the idea was simple enough to sound brilliant. Mobile Task Force Tau-1 would move ahead of SCP-096's projected route and evacuate civilians. But this time, they would not be forced to risk direct visual exposure. They would wear specially designed night vision systems fitted with internal processors trained to recognize SCP-096's facial structure. The moment the anomaly entered view, the system would scramble the image before the relevant visual data could be processed by the human brain. A technological blindfold. A machine-speed shield against a visual curse. It was the kind of plan the Foundation loves. Controlled, elegant, rational. The belief that if a threat can be defined precisely enough, it can be engineered around. And at first, it seemed to work. Tau-1 successfully moved through towns in the projected path, evacuating civilians and managing the chaos as the anomaly advanced. There must have been some hope in that phase, however guarded. The sense that perhaps the impossible had finally been reduced to a systems problem. That human cleverness had, once again, found a way to stand in front of something ancient and terrible without being devoured by it. But machine logic has to survive contact with reality, and reality is always messier than design. When SCP-096 reached one of the populated areas along its path, the situation became chaotic. Civilians panicked. Blindfolds were removed. Personnel turned toward the anomaly through scramble lenses, trusting the processors to do their work. The fatal flaw was time. Not much time. Fractions of a second. But in an event defined by visual exposure, fractions of a second are the whole war. The processors could identify and scramble the face only after the incoming visual data had already begun passing through the system, which meant the operatives received stray, unfiltered exposure before the block could fully engage. that was enough. And in that instant, Project Scramble transformed from solution to catastrophe. The task force was compromised. Civilians who saw the anomaly were compromised. The town became a chain of new targets and fresh violence. Gunfire, screaming, blind panic, and the renewed frenzy of SCP-096 collapsed into one another. The very equipment designed to save the team had instead helped deliver the thing they were trying to avoid. Just enough of the face to condemn them. For the Foundation, the failure of Scramble was not merely tactical. It was philosophical. A brutal demonstration that the problem of SCP-096 was not one that could be cleanly solved through better optics and faster processors. They were not facing a security gap. They were facing a rule of the world that did not care how prepared they felt. And then the aftermath grew darker. According to the material developed around the incident, senior researcher Dr. Dan had been one of the principal minds behind Scramble. But he was also one of the people most convinced that true containment of SCP-096 was a lie. Not difficult, not imperfect. A lie. In his view, the Foundation was not keeping the anomaly safely locked away. It was simply buying time until the next accidental exposure, the next photograph, the next leak, the next person somewhere in the world who looked at the wrong image and pulled the pin on an event no one could stop. That fear becomes much easier to understand when you look at the problem from his perspective. We live by documentation. Photographs, archived footage, surveillance systems, cloud storage, family albums, digitized tapes, news reports, endless screens. Human beings preserve everything. We make copies of our days. We scatter recorded images of our lives across devices, boxes, basements, servers, and forgotten drawers. In a world where SCP-096 exists, that habit becomes apocalyptic. Because the real horror is not only the creature in the cube, it is the possibility that somewhere, right now, its face already exists inside some overlooked record. A forgotten expedition photo, a home video, a box of undeveloped film, a background detail no one has noticed yet, a tiny pale dot in a landscape someone will eventually decide to revisit on a quiet evening. And when that happens, the victim may not even know they have triggered anything at all. That is what makes SCP-096 feel less like a monster and more like a curse on memory itself. The danger is hidden inside ordinary acts of looking back, inside nostalgia, inside curiosity, inside the deeply human urge to open a drawer and see who we used to be. The expanded material tied to the Scramble aftermath pushes this idea even further. It suggests that Dr. Dan's behavior was not only driven by fear, but by the conviction that the Foundation would never act decisively unless it was forced to confront the scale of the threat in blood. The implication is moral rot, institutional panic, and a willingness to sacrifice lives in order to prove what he believed was already obvious. As long as SCP-096 exists, containment is temporary, and civilization is vulnerable to something as small as a few pixels. Whether you frame that as sabotage, fanaticism, or the logic of a man cornered by certainty, it leaves a stain over the entire story. Because now the horror is not only the anomaly, it is also the people around it. The people who study it, fail against it, rationalize it, and slowly begin to realize that every available choice is monstrous in its own way. And beneath all of that, SCP-096 remains exactly what it was at the beginning. A pale figure in the dark, covering its face, pacing, crying, waiting for the next accidental summons. I think that is why this case lingers with people. Not because it is the loudest SCP, not because it has the most elaborate mythology, but because it attacks something so foundational that we rarely think to question it. The idea that seeing gives us power. The idea that knowledge protects us. The idea that if danger is small enough, distant enough, blurred enough, it ceases to matter. SCP-096 answers all of those assumptions with the same terrible lesson. No distance is safe enough. No glance is small enough. No ignorance is innocent enough. Somewhere, perhaps in a sealed archive or a family attic, or the neglected storage bin at the back of a closet, there may still be another image waiting. Another harmless photograph with too much mountain in the frame. Another tiny pale mark in the background of someone else's memory. Another person who will one day look without understanding, then set the picture down and go quietly on with their evening for one final minute or two. And somewhere else, in a chamber with no windows and no cameras, something will stop pacing. It will raise its hands to its face. It will begin to scream. And then it will come. So tonight, before you switch off the lamp, before you let the room fall fully into shadow, perhaps spare a thought for the old photographs in your own home, the inherited boxes, the dusty albums, the little preserved fragments of places and people you barely remember. Ask yourself what might be hiding in the background of a life you thought was already over. I have been Seraphine Corvin. Thank you for listening to Midnight Echo Radio. May your nights be quiet and your shadows empty.